Hello and welcome. Midterm 3 scores are now posted in Carmen for our class. The stats for all the other Chem 1210 classes are not yet known, so I can't tell you what the overall average is for all of Chem 1210. It looks to be in the range of the upper 60s to low 70s though. You can track your scores on all the midterms. In fact, I would recommend that everyone take a look at all of their combined scores by taking their midterm 1 score, write it in here, or just multiply it by 10. Take your midterm 2 score, that is the percent you earned on the exam, that's listed in Carmen, times 12.5, and take your score midterm 3 times 15. These are the weightings of midterms 1, 2, and 3. The finals were 25% looking forward towards the final. But for these 3 exams, the total works out to be 37.5. So if you take all of your scores, add them up together, divide by 37.5, then you'll get your total score in terms of a percentage earned on all 3 of the exams. And overall, right now in the class, it's about a 70% average for all 3 exams factored in together. So if you're close to a 70, then I would say your grade's close to the C plus to possibly the B minus range if you're right at this average. If you're better than the average, then your grade would be in these ranges or better. And if you're below the average, obviously in the ranges below these. So take into account your average. I think we have grades that range all the way up to about like a 95% plus percent. So you probably want to be about 3 to 4% higher than the average to receive the next higher letter grade. I'd probably take right at the average score to be about a C plus right now. So if you are looking towards getting a B minus, I would say, well, if your grade's about a 74% averaging on the exams, I'd say your exam score is about in the range that we would set into the B minus range by the metric that we set our final grades. We mentioned this a few times before, but what we do is we look for the average total grade in the class, set that in the range of about a C plus. If our class is thought to perhaps be better than some past offerings of Chem 1210, maybe we'll get a slight improvement in our average. Maybe it'll be set closer to a B minus. Likewise, I don't think this is the case, but if for some reason we thought our class was doing poor, then maybe we'd set our average closer into the middle C range. But I think right now, our class average at the end of the semester will be set close to a C plus. Like I said, at the worst, it would be better, an improved grade from there when we set these at the end of the semester. So the way we set grades is we look at the average of a class, set that to a letter grade, and then set the other grade ranges up and down from that particular percentage. We don't change scores, we don't add to your score, take away from your score. We're setting a scale specifically for our own Chem 1210 class. Now this scale is generally separate from all the other Chem 1210 classes. Each class has their own homework grading systems, their own recitation grading systems. So it's hard to look at a absolute grade in one class and compare that directly with some other class. So what really matters is not necessarily just your exam score. What matters is your cumulative score. We'll take a look at that towards the end of this presentation here. So let's remind ourselves of how we calculate our homework score. So you can add up all of your earned points using the Mastering Gradebook. Remember, the Carmen Gradebook has some issues. We will be sorting out grades. In fact, your Carmen Gradebook score, I don't think is even factoring into your total grade. So we're going to take your scores out of Mastering, do the math correctly, upload them into Carmen at the end of the semester. So take your earned points through Sunday. There are 424 points through the next problem set due Sunday night. I've actually pushed it back to Monday night too. So that's through Monday's problem set. Okay, so if you're looking at the points for spring break, just add in the points required on the next pre-lecture assignment if you're curious of how many points you should earn through Thanksgiving. And if you're paying attention and you haven't looked at the schedule, the next homework set after Tuesday's lecture, like the next problem set's due the following Monday evening, since some of you guys may be returning from out of town on Sunday. In fact, I made all the Sunday due dates for the rest of the semester to be due Monday nights. So we actually won't have any Sunday due dates for the rest of the term. We'll have them all due on Monday evenings for the remainder of the term. If you want to look at the total semester, you need to earn 494 points. So through the end of the semester, it'll be 494 points. I've now added in all of the remaining homework assignments for chapters 11 and 12. I have not yet added in a few of the last daily extra assignments. So there's a few extra assignments I still have to add in, but I've added the daily extras through next week and the first half of the week after Thanksgiving, so you can get a sense of what those assignments look like. Okay, so this is your total that you need to earn by the end of the class if you want a 100% homework score. So if you're not at that score yet, maybe try to do some of the extra assignments if you wish, but also know that as long as you're close to this grade, your score is still going to be pretty good. So we'll take your total earned score at the end of the semester and divide it by 494. And then calculate the percentage of those points that you earn, again with the idea 100% maximum is the maximum score for homework. So your lecture score, let's give an update on Top Hat. So Top Hat so far, we've asked 106 total questions. So that means you have 106 times 1.25 points that you may have earned. Your score in Top Hat shows you the percentage of those points that you've earned, but our grades calculated a little bit differently. So what I have to do is download your grades at the end of the semester and apply a little bit of math in Excel before I upload them into Carmen. Carmen does show a score right now, but it's not it's not correcting for your actual score by the true metric by the way I grade homework or the Top Hat problems in class, and it's also not live updated, so we haven't pushed an update in quite a while. So check your total score on Top Hat. See how many points that you've earned. So look for your number of points. You might have to actually add this up in terms of your participation points versus your correct points, but add those together, get your total score, and then divide that by the total number of content questions I've asked starting in week 2. So this means, or what ended up happening was I asked 9 questions in week 1 that were all available for extra credit points, and I've also asked, I believe, 4 survey questions so far that are bonus points as well. So that's a total of 13 bonus questions, and then the difference from 106, so that would be plus 93 content questions week 2 and beyond. So what this means is you need to earn 93 points. So 93 points right now in the class is how many points you would need for a 100% lecture score. So what I would do is take your total score that you've earned. So I take your total and I divide that by 93 points and multiply that by 100%. Again, 100% is the maximum score. And so if you track that the total maximum points that you could have earned in this class so far would be 106 total questions times 1.25 points. That's, I believe, over 130 points. So that means as long as your Top Hat score is greater than about 70%, then you really have the 100% maximum score. So as long as your Top Hat score is a 70% or higher, you truly have a 100% score. And if you're close to a 70%, then you're close to a 100% score. So maybe if you attend the last few lectures and get a majority of the questions correct, then you can end up still with a perfect score. So there's still points left to earn. I do have a couple survey questions planned in case anybody happens to be on the line. So you can keep attending if you need to earn more points. But again, these points here aren't necessarily to motivate you to come to class every day. They're just here to give you some credit for being in class, to give you a little bit of a reward, and also to get you guys comfortable with working together and collaborating in class, which I think is, a more helpful and productive classroom. Okay, so you can go through this chart here. We presented this, I think, after midterm 2. You could go through and look at your lab score and kind of write in your earned percentage. Lab is 20% of your grade. Typical average in lab is about 85%. Typical homework average ends up at about 90%, and that accounts for 7.5% of your grade. So you can take your score here and then multiply it by 20, take your score, multiply it by 7.5 for your homework. Same thing for recitation. Hopefully you're not losing ground in recitation because those are easy points as long as you're going and participating. Lecture score, much the same way. As long as you're present and participating, you're probably getting close to a perfect score. And so take your earned score times 5% and do the same thing with midterm 1, 2, and 3. The actual averages are shown for the midterms, and I think midterm 3 is probably going to fall close to a 70% when all is said and done. So then we have the final left to go. What you might do is just take your total score thus far, just divide by 75 and see where you stand at the moment. And then you can also play around with throwing in different scores of, like consider getting a 95% on the final, or consider getting your midterm average on the final, and kind of see where your total score might be tracking. I think if all of these, if the final average ends up being about a 70, likewise for midterm 3, I think we'll end up at about a 77% overall average, and that'll be the score that's kind of setting the C+ range, which likely doesn't give us, much a very big perceived curve, if you will. But at the same time, you have to remember that we didn't go into the class defining any particular grade to receive any particular letter grade at the end of the semester. So this class is always kind of graded on a bell curve, and this grade here is improved when there's metrics that support a class being better than the average class. And we see things like better lab averages. If you see maybe homework scores better than what we tend to see, if we see exam scores that are better than we tend to see, then maybe this grade goes up a little bit from where we might ordinarily set it in a given term. So in a way, we sometimes we joke that you want the class to do poorly so you can do well on a test, but really you want the class to do well on the exam so we're judged to be a better class so we can get curved to a better letter grade. That's on average how we give out better grades in a class like this, is for the class to do well, the class to show success, and then we can get a better curve applied or a better average grade set for our class. So I don't know if you need much motivation to study. I hope you don't need motivation from me in this video to study for the final, but keep studying for the final, because the class as a whole, the better the class does, the better our average grade can be in the class, the more better grades we can give out at the end of the semester. So how do you improve on the final? We've mentioned this a few times before, but I think just incorporating when you watch videos versus when you read, how you work sample and practice exercises, how often you do these problems, when you're doing them. I think the goal of a class like this is try to learn content and then apply it to problem solving. And I think if you're doing a lot of your book reading as you're doing problem set problems, that I would say try to space your studying out to do the reading first, maybe a couple of days before a problem set. And then when it comes time to doing the problem set, hopefully you're not needing the book as much and you're able to solve a majority of those problems just using the content that you've learned. So I think reducing the amount of times on, say, a problem set or a practice exam problem, the number of times that you have to look something up is a good sign that you've had a lot of learning that's taken place. If you have to look up how to do a problem, you should really think about this. If you see that same problem or a similar looking problem in a couple of days after you see the problem set, will you still remember how to do the problem? If not, then I think we need to just find ways to more productively go about our time, so that we don't have to spend hours doing a homework set only to forget all that information later and then not be able to remember it when it comes time for exams. So I think it's just spacing out the lecture watching, the video watching, the book reading. So figure out for you, and I think everybody's a little bit different in terms of, should you read a detailed reading before class? I think if your grades aren't where you want them to be, try something different. So if you haven't tried to detailed read the coverage we're covering in a lecture before class, give it a shot. Maybe you'll get more out of lecture. Maybe you'll be the leader showing people how to solve problems in lecture, and then you'll be that much better off come problem sets and the final exam. Study groups are helpful, maybe if you're doing problem sets or studying for the final. So you can form study groups if you wish, your friends in the dorm or friends from lab, and focus on learning more about whatever's confusing. So if you don't understand something, I guarantee you can make sense of it if you uncover enough of the underlying information about the topic. So keep working at the concepts you don't understand. My cat's walking on my iPad. So focus on what you find confusing and try to build on it, and go back as far as you need to, especially for the final. If there's something back in chapter 2 that you found confusing in chapter 2, I bet you can make more sense of it now, having seen all the other new chemistry that we've seen since then. So maybe some things will start to make more sense when we start to review them and look forward towards the final. Okay, so the final exam. We've previously used an ACS standardized exam. We are not using an ACS standardized exam this year. So if you hear people say, oh, they use an ACS test and it's easy, well, I would say it never really was quite easy, or quote unquote easy. I don't think I would characterize an exam that half the class scores below a 75% on average as easy. At the same time, I don't necessarily think that our test that we've written for the final will necessarily be that much harder. I think we've written a test that's a little bit more inclusive of a couple chapters that we cover that weren't on the ACS exam. The old ACS exam we used in the past few years did not cover chapters 11 or 12. We're going to be putting those questions on our midterm though. We will be covering chapter 11 and then just some brief parts of chapter 12. We'll update those parts and talk more about that later. But, we're going to see maybe like 3 questions from chapter 12 on the final, but we'll see on average about 5 or 6 questions from each of the other chapters. So we're not going to see as heavily of a weighting of chapter 12. And even like chapters 10 and 11 won't be especially weighted heavily on the test. They'll be weighted about the same as all the other chapters. One question that I was having in my head is, will the sample info you get on the final exam be similar to the midterms? It should be. I don't know that for sure yet, or I haven't seen the final sample info page that you get with the final, but I would expect that if we gave you information on any of the midterms, that we would provide that same information to you on the final. There's usually not much provided on the final from chapter 10. So you should do enough problems where you know the ideal gas constant and its units. The same thing with the 8.314 joules per mole Kelvin. Units for R, you should probably know that as well. But we'll update the information you're getting on the test around the time that we start posting some practice materials. I'm not sure when we're going to have practice materials ready. I wouldn't necessarily count on these being posted soon, but maybe sometime after Thanksgiving we'll get some practice materials posted up on a Carmen, so you can look for that to do some practice questions if you wish before the final. So my study tips here, looking forward to maybe a long weekend. If you do have some time to study over Thanksgiving, what should you do? Or if you're just looking to, once you get back from Thanksgiving, how should you start preparing for the final? I think if you could devote a 1-hour session, give or take, to each chapter, maybe like 1 session a day in the 2 weeks leading up to the final exam would be really helpful. What I would recommend is beginning by going to the chapter summary at the end of each of the chapters. So maybe start chapter 1, go to the end of the chapter, reread the chapter summary, review the learning outcomes that are listed in your textbook. If you're using the e-text, you can click on some of the associated questions. In particular, if you read a learning objective and you don't remember what it means, you can certainly click the associated question and remind yourself of what's being asked. You could do some of those problems if needed. You could look for other related homework problems in the end of chapters. You could go back through practice and sample exercises in the text as needed. Rereading the text as needed. You can rewatch lecture videos. And the one thing I think that you'll see is that there were probably some topics that you weren't 100% clear on at the time that now in retrospect maybe you can gain some clarity in. So maybe by reviewing and looking back at some of the content, you can make sense of some of the concepts that you were struggling with back when we took midterm 2, midterm 1, 2, or 3. So if you could devote, I would go linearly, so start chapter 1 on maybe Monday when we get back after Thanksgiving, maybe on Tuesday try to review chapter 2, and just depending on where you're at with the chapter, you may need to spend more or less time. So if you're pretty solid on, say, chapter 3, then looking over the chapter summary and the learning outcomes might only take you 20 minutes. If you're needing some review, maybe it takes you an hour and a half. But I think however much time you need to study will be pretty clear, because when you're reading through a summary, if something is unclear to you, I think it'll stand out as being unclear. So you could go do some extra problems or reviewing as needed. And if you do some of this review work, I think you'll be all that more prepared to take a practice exam and not have to struggle on as many questions. So then when you're reviewing your wrong answers from a practice packet, I think you're going to be more likely to have fewer questions that you need to review, but then also some good targeting of some last concepts to focus on your remaining studying. I think if you look at preparing for the final just a couple of days before the final or the weekend before, you're going to kind of run into the issue of almost like memorizing or cramming all this content in when it's really all ties together pretty easily if you give yourself the chance to see how little actual content there is that you actually need to quote unquote memorize, and just how much of this information can be internalized or made sense of so that you can just use that information and that knowledge to help you solve problems on the exam. So I'd start sooner rather than later, but also start very slow. So I would just start one chapter at a time, or at least one chapter per sitting. Try to let that information sink in if you need to. Review some content as needed. You can rewatch videos. You can do all kinds of things for the sections that you're struggling in the most. Okay, so that's all the information I have for today. Thank you for the attention. Have a great weekend.